When we think of Cuba today, we often think of a small island frozen in time, vintage cars, colorful buildings, and a long-standing political standoff with the United States. But the history between these two nations is much more than just a Cold War rivalry. It is a story that goes back to the very birth of the United States. In fact, without Cuba, the America we know today might not even exist. In this video, we'll explore how Cuba went from being the lifeline of the American Revolution to a strategic target, a playground for the mafia, and eventually a nuclear flashpoint. This is the deep, often overlooked history of the US and Cuba. To understand this relationship, we have to travel back to 1781. The American Revolutionary War was at a breaking point. George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, was facing a disaster. His soldiers were tired, hungry, and on the verge of mutiny because they hadn't been paid in months. Washington needed money, and he needed it fast, to fund what would become the decisive Battle of Yorktown. At this critical moment, Washington turned to his allies. A French admiral named de Grasse reached out to the Spanish colony of Cuba. The response from Havana was nothing short of extraordinary. When the call for help reached the streets of Havana, it wasn't just the government that responded. Legend tells us that ordinary citizens, men and women alike, donated their personal savings and even their jewelry to help the American cause. In just 6 hours, they collected 500,000 silver pesos. This Cuban silver was shipped to Washington's troops. It allowed him to pay his soldiers and secure the supplies needed to win the Battle of Yorktown, which ultimately led to American independence. At this moment, Cuba was a savior, but as the new United States began to grow, its gratitude soon turned into a different kind of interest, strategic ambition. As the 19th century dawned, the United States began to look at its surroundings with a new sense of power. The island of Cuba sits just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For American leaders, this wasn't just a nearby island. It was the key to the Gulf of Mexico. Thomas Jefferson, the third U.S. president, was very open about his desires. He viewed Cuba as the most interesting addition that could ever be made to the American system of states. He believed that the U.S. must, at some point, acquire Cuba to ensure its own national security. This era was defined by a concept called manifest destiny. This was the belief held by many Americans that the United States was divinely ordained, basically chosen by a higher power to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. By 1854, this ambition took a more aggressive turn with the Ostend Manifesto. This was a secret document written by U.S. diplomats suggesting that if Spain, which then ruled Cuba, refused to sell the island, the United States would be justified in wresting it from Spain by force. The logic was simple. The U.S. believed it needed Cuba more than Spain did, and they were willing to steal it if they couldn't buy it. By the late 1890s, the Cuban people had been fighting a long and bloody war for independence against Spanish colonial rule. They were very close to winning. However, the United States was watching closely, and they didn't want a truly independent Cuba that they couldn't control. The turning point came in 1898 when the U.S. battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor. While we still don't know for sure what caused the explosion, the U.S. blamed Spain and used it as an excuse to declare war. This became the Spanish-American War. The U.S. military arrived in Cuba, but instead of fighting alongside the Cuban rebels as equals, they largely ignored them. When Spain surrendered, the U.S. didn't allow the Cuban leaders to attend the peace talks. Washington effectively stole the victory from the Cubans. Instead of full independence, Cuba was subjected to U.S. military occupation. To ensure they kept control, the U.S. forced Cuba to include the Platt Amendment in its new constitution. This document gave the U.S. the legal right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit and granted the U.S. a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba was free on paper, but in reality, it was a client state of Washington. In the early 20th century, the relationship shifted again. In 1920, the United States entered the era of prohibition, a period where the sale of alcohol was made illegal. This turned Havana into the ultimate destination for Americans looking for things they couldn't do at home. Cuba became a pleasure island. It was a place for gambling, drinking, and nightlife. By the 1940s and 50s, Under the rule of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, this grew into something much darker. Batista maintained a very close relationship with American organized crime, the Mafia. Names like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano invested heavily in Havana's luxury hotels and casinos. While the American elite and tourists enjoyed the glittering nightlife, the reality for the average Cuban was very different. The country was marked by extreme poverty, lack of education, and a government that used brutal repression and torture to silence anyone who disagreed with Batista. To the U.S. government, Batista was a reliable ally who protected American business interests. To the Cuban people, he was tyrant. This inequality set the stage for one of the most significant events of the 20th century, the Cuban Revolution. In 1959, a group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara successfully overthrew Batista. Initially, Castro wasn't openly a communist, but he immediately began to dismantle American influence. He nationalized, meaning the government took control of U.S.-owned sugar plantations, mines, and utility companies. He wanted to redistribute the land to the poor peasants. The U.S. responded with economic sanctions, trying to squeeze the new government. This hostility pushed Castro to look for a new powerful friend, and he found one in the Soviet Union. This was the height of the Cold War, a global struggle for influence between the democratic U.S. and the communist Soviet Union. The tension peaked in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets began placing nuclear missiles on the island, capable of reaching almost any major U.S. city. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of a total nuclear war. The crisis ended when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise never to invade Cuba. From that point on, Cuba was no longer an American playground. It was a communist fortress just miles from the Florida coast. For the next several decades, Cuba lived in a state of isolation, heavily dependent on the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba entered a devastating economic crisis. Food and fuel became scarce, but the political system remained. Fast forward to 2014. President Barack Obama announced a historic shift. He argued that 50 years of isolation had failed to bring change. He moved to restore diplomatic relations, eased travel restrictions, and even became the first U.S. president to visit Cuba since 1928. It was a moment of hope, aimed at slowly integrating Cuba back into the global economy through soft power rather than threats. However, this thaw was short-lived. With the arrival of Donald Trump in 2016, the policy shifted back to maximum pressure. The Trump administration canceled many of the new travel openings, labeled Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism again, and returned to a policy of harsh rhetoric and threats. Today, the relationship between the United States and Cuba remains in a state of uncertainty. We have seen a cycle that has lasted over 200 years, from essential allies during the American Revolution to strategic rivals, and from business partners to bitter enemies. The story of Cuba is a reminder of how geography and politics are deeply intertwined. For the U.S., Cuba has always been too close to ignore. For Cuba, the U.S. has been a shadow that is too big to escape. As we look to the future, the question remains, can these two neighbors ever find a way to move past their history, or are they destined to remain in this cycle of conflict? Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shapes our world today.